As we speak, 10 American sailors have been freed from Iranian custody. It was a brief incident. Does Jordan trust Iran?
We have relations with Iran, but we obviously see their involvement beyond their borders in Yemen, in Africa. Obviously, they're involved in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan. So we have to contend with their presence beyond their borders.
As you know, in the coming days, the U.S. and other international partners are going to lift sanctions, and $100 billion maybe will flow into Iran very, very quickly. They can do with it whatever they want. Is that a source of concern to Jordan?
It's a concern to a lot of us in the region, and I think further afield. And so that's what I said. There's a linkages between the nuclear deal and how Iran performs on the other portfolios. And so I think they're going to be held up to how they perform also on those other sectors, and we'll have to see how that happens and where we hold them accountable on what other potential mischiefs may be found.
In President Obama's State of the Union address, he said that the fight against ISIS should not be labeled another World War III, because that, he says, plays into the hands of ISIS propaganda. You've called this war against ISIS almost like a World War III. Do you see this war against ISIS now as World War III?
Well, I've said that the war against the Khawarij, the outlaws of Islam, is a third world war by other means, which is probably slightly different. And how I've explained it, it's not just ISIS. All these groups, whether from the Philippines or in Indonesia all the way to Mali, these are all the same, whether it's ISIS, Boko Haram, Shabab, Al-Nusra, wherever you find them around the world. And again, as I said, from Asia all the way to the African continent, there is either a full-out war or counterinsurgency warfare. This is a global struggle that brings, as I've said many times, Muslims, Christians, Jews, other religions fighting alongside us as we fight our civil war inside of Islam.
The Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi says ISIS can be defeated this year. In the President's State of the Union address, he says this is a war that's going to go on. It's going to be a generational war. What's your assessment?
Well, again, let's make the differentiation when we say ISIS, Syria, or Iraq, or if we're saying this global war against the Khawarij, the outlaws of Islam. So ISIS, Syria, and Iraq can be defeated fairly quickly, but the global war, what I call the Third World War by other means, is one that is a generational one. Hopefully the military security aspect is the short term, or the military part is the short term. The mid-term is going to be the intelligence and security aspect. The long term is the ideological one and the educational one.
And that's a generational war?
That's a generational one, not only inside of Islam, as we as Muslims regained the supremacy against the crazies, the outlaws of our religion, but also reaching out to other religions that Islam is not what they have seen being perpetuated by 0.1% of our religion.
The U.S. says most of the airstrikes against ISIS have been U.S. airstrikes. The coalition, other countries, whether the Europeans, Jordan, UAE, Saudis, maybe 6% of the airstrikes. And the suggestion is the coalition, is not doing enough.
I know the figures of the amount of airstrikes that we did, not counting the amount of air patrols and reconnaissance flights that we did. We've been hitting tremendous amounts of ground targets. We've always wanted to hit more. And I think that having a good relationship with the Secretary of Defense, and there's a couple of new generals in the Pentagon now that I think want to fix bayonets and go over the parapet. I think that you'll see an increase in tempo. There's been some good operations. I can say that from the Jordanian perspective, we want to see a bit more, and that's one of the reasons why we've visited DC. And it comes down to this issue of synchronization. How do we bring it all together? This is something that's been discussed over the past several months, and this is what we're trying to do now. What is Jordan's maximum effort, and what can we do to really close the circle? what do the Iraqis do, what do the Turks do, what do the Kurds do, in coordination with the rest of the coalition. Vienna is very important because how do we deal with the Russians? In my view, if we can get the Russians to be part of the synchronization, even better. But that's a problem between Moscow and Washington.
Do you believe that Russia and Iran, in dealing with the future of Syria, might abandon Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian leader, and allow him to sort of abdicate, move away?
My discussions with President Putin is we need to move the political process forward as quickly as possible. Obviously, there are those countries that say that Bashar has to move today, and the Russians are saying not before 18 months. And I'll talk about this from our point of view because obviously we have the Free Syrian Army in the south, and we're working with the Russians of creating a ceasefire with our forces in the south. And I specifically had discussion with Putin. You can't expect young men and women to put their arms down and abide by a ceasefire if there's no movement on the political process in Vienna. They're not going to sit there and do this for 2 or 3 months and not expect something to happen. So the Russians are fully aware that sooner rather than later we have to have a mechanism that allows the process to move forward. And I think we all understand that that does mean the departure of Bashar.
Republican presidential candidate Senator Ted Cruz has called allowing Syrian refugees into the United States his word lunacy. Donald Trump, the Republican presidential frontrunner now, says taking in Syrian refugees could be a Trojan horse in the United States. When you hear these comments, what's your reaction?
We definitely know that, and so you have to be careful about the screening. But at the same time, we can't let probably the 80% of the other refugees or the 90% of the other refugees suffer at the same time. So it's always going to be a balance of your moral code of being able to look after people that are in plight to the balance of security. And this is something that we've always had to deal with.
How many Syrian refugees has Jordan accepted?
More. We have about 1.2, 1.3 million refugees at the moment, but obviously we've accepted more than that because some have come in, some have gone back into Syria, and some have gone to other countries.
Because as you know, here in the United States, there's a big debate about allowing Syrian refugees into the United States. About 1,500 so far have been accepted. The administration says maybe 10,000 will be able to come in. Do you believe the U.S. is doing enough to help Syrian refugees?
Well, we have been challenged recently because there's 12,000 or 14,000 refugees across our border on the eastern side that have not been allowed to come in except for very strict screening. Part of the problem is they've come from the north of Syria, from Raqqa, Hasaka, and Deir ez-Zor, which is the heartland of where ISIS is. We know that there are ISIS members inside those camps. We have tremendous pressure from NGOs and other countries that keep telling us that we have to let them in. We vet about 50 to 100 every day. We do have our government and our military and our hospitals as well as NGOs on the other side looking after them. But the pressure we get from the international community saying, look, we've already got 1.2. So from a humanitarian point of view and a moral point of view, you really can't question our determination. But this particular group has a major red flag when it comes to our security, and so we're being very, very careful on vetting. So I tend to understand when other countries are concerned, but at the same time, we can't ignore the plight of refugees, and we have to let people in.
What's your reaction to Donald Trump saying that there should be a temporary ban on Muslims coming into the United States until the U.S. can figure out what's going on right now?
I think that's the same challenge that we're being pushed to at the moment with the group that we're talking about. And we're saying to those, we've had this comment given to us by the United States that you need to allow these refugees into the country. So we're going back to the United States where these comments have been made, saying, look, we understand, we are trying to bring these people in, but we're trying to make sure that the mechanisms that we put in place make sure it's never going to be foolproof, but we're going to try and make it as sterile as possible. But like I said, we're accepting 50 to 100 every day from an area that we know there's a major danger. Obviously, it's those that are ill, the elderly, women and children, I know some people can be callous and say, well, let all the women in, but as you saw in California and we've seen in Paris recently, women unfortunately have been part of terrorist organizations and terrorist strikes. But we can't ignore and just keep refugees isolated. So you just got to be smart, and you've got to think with a heart.
Because Donald Trump isn't just talking about refugees, he's talking about all Muslims on a temporary basis not being allowed to come into the United States. You're a major Muslim leader of a Muslim country. You hear these comments, your reaction?
You're into election cycle, so I don't think it's fair for you to ask a foreign leader to express his opinion on candidates in your country running for election.
The Saudis, as you know, executed a Shiite cleric, others accused of terrorism. In response, the Saudi embassy in Tehran was burnt and ransacked. The Saudis severed diplomatic relations. Other Sunni Arab countries, the UAE and Kuwait and Bahrain, Qatar, they downgraded or severed relations. Jordan didn't. Why?
Well, we are in coordination with the Saudis. We took a firm position against what the Iranians did. We fully support our Saudi friends, and we took the position that we took. We put in the Iranian ambassador and expressed our displeasure. This was done in coordination with our Saudi allies. We have an amazingly strong relationship with our Saudi brethren. My relationship with His Majesty the King, the Crown Prince and the Deputy Crown Prince are extremely strong. And this was the position that we had worked out between ourselves. And again, don't forget that we are part of the Vienna talks when it comes to Syria. So it was felt that having us in a bit more of a flexible position at the talks is probably more prudent at this stage. And obviously there is now heightened tensions between the Saudis and the Iranians. That is going to play out in the Vienna talks. But more importantly, what I think the Saudis looking at the higher moral ground, don't want this to escalate into a regional Shia-Sunni conflict. So I think everybody's trying to make sure that we can calm this down and focus on what needs to be done, especially at the Vienna talks table.
Because I know Jordan has very good relations with Saudi Arabia, yes. But did you have a problem with their execution, the beheading of these terrorists?
No, they told us about this beforehand. This is an internal issue. And we respect, obviously, their decisions and their internal decisions cycle. And as we said, we fully supported what they had to do.
Your Majesty, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you so much. Welcome to Washington.
Thank you very much.